So please do, as I say, as Joseph said, there'll be a chance for questions and discussion at the end, but if there's any particular questions, certainly within the room that you've got whilst we go along, please do ask. So first of all, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on what a compulsory purchase order is. I don't know whether any of you have had experience of working on any CPO related projects or not before, but it is essentially a process whereby various public or other bodies have enabling powers that allow them to acquire land without the owner's consent. The part of the slide on the right shows you who some of those bodies are, and I will say that's only a small selection of the bodies. There are numerous bodies that have CPO powers under various different pieces of legislation, but the ones that quite often are most utilising them would be Transport Scotland and Scottish ministers, and in some cases local authorities as well. Network Rail also tends to use them for some of their schemes. CPO is really something that you'd be wanting to use only where that acquisition is absolutely necessary and it's in the public interest, because it is very much recognised that it's a very difficult thing to do, to acquire somebody's private land without their consent effectively. So you really need to be taking that careful balance to make sure that it's in the public interest and it's there are wider benefits to doing it. CPO will be something that will sit alongside other consenting regimes, so whether that be planning permission or whether it be roads orders or a transport order or Electricity Act consent, etc. But regardless of who the consenting body is for the main project, the CPO will require Scottish ministers to confirm it before it can go ahead. And one of the key principles of CPO is that owners will be compensated for the land that's taken from them, but they should be no worse off financially than they were beforehand. So why use CPO? So it really is something that can be part of the planning toolbox. It isn't used very often, and particularly not by local authorities, but it certainly is a means that is available to local authorities and to other bodies to try and achieve some of the outcomes that they are looking to do. So, particularly in the context of where we sit just now, we've got housing emergency across Scotland, and many local authorities have identified that they've got a housing emergency in their own local areas. We've got aspirations to try and make sure that we get better infrastructure in place and get that in place early on to try and help deliver and enable development, whether that be transport infrastructure or utilities infrastructure, electricity, all these sorts of things. We have got obviously outcomes to try and get towards a transition towards net zero. So again, there's opportunities there, and there's very much opportunities around trying to regenerate some of our places and town centres and using CPO where it's justified in that. Some of the reasons where you might be using CPO might be where it's a particularly complex land assembly. So for example, if it's a major project that covers multiple different landowners, you might be looking at it on that basis. You might be looking at it on the basis that the land itself has been neglected or vacant or derelict for some time, and it really requires the authority to come in and invest in that. And obviously, in some cases, it may be that you've got a project that is in the wider public interest, but you've got a particular owner that is not willing to sell their land, and therefore you might be considering it in those options as well. So, as I say, CPO sits along a whole host of enabling powers, which are set out in various pieces of legislation, and I've put down a few of them here, but that is only a small reference of the number of pieces of legislation that give enabling powers. In 2014, the Law Commission undertook some research into CPO and the use of it, and identified, I think, 80 plus pieces of legislation which confer enabling powers onto different bodies so that they can use CPO. Some of the ones that I think are used most regularly are, particularly under the Road Scotland Act, Transport Scotland uses it regularly in terms of acquiring land to achieve schemes for improving or upgrading the trunk road system. Network Rail, as I say, has used it in the past or looks to use it in terms of upgrading its railway infrastructure. There are powers certainly under the Planning Act and Planning and Housing Act. So Glasgow City Council is one of the councils that is certainly using its CPO powers more often than I think most other local authorities, where they're using it to acquire empty homes and bring those back into active use to try and address the housing emergency. But actually, most councils probably are not really using it, if at all. And I think part of the reason for that is because the legislation is very old, it's very complex and difficult. These processes can take years, and they can be costly to get through that process as well. So certainly there are a number of things that are probably seen as a barrier to local authorities or other bodies in trying to use their CPO powers. So the Scottish Government has been undertaking a programme of CPO reform. I was involved with that for the last couple of years as part of their practitioner advisory group, just to help discuss and test out some of the options that they were considering. And that included publishing a consultation in autumn last year, which set out where they want to get to. And the overall aim is, as it says here, to make compulsory purchase can't read this in this one. Make the compulsory system fairer, more streamlined and fairer for all to help deliver development in new homes. Alongside those enabling powers that I had on the last slide, which set out how you would get, what sort of things you can acquire land for, there's a number of various different pieces of legislation which set out the powers around acquiring land. As you can see here, I don't know if you can see these slides from where you're sitting, one of those pieces of legislation dates back to 1845. So it's not particularly new or modern legislation. And certainly that's been a key focus of the council's, of the Scottish Government's programme of reform, to test out whether it might be possible to try and consolidate and update a lot of that legislation to make it easier and more streamlined and fairer for everybody to use. So I think the intention is, the consultation closed late last year. Scottish Government is now considering all of the responses that were made to it. Nothing will obviously be happening within this Parliament term, which is just closing, but the hope is that there will be a bill coming forward in the next Parliament term, which will set out how they want to go forward with that. So some of the core principles of acquiring land, as I said, you must look at whether there's a public interest test. It's not a case of a public body saying, well, we need to buy that land to buy something just because it makes our life easier. You really have to have a sort of a fairly strong justification in terms of meeting that public interest test. You need to consider how you're going to do it proportionally, and try, bearing in mind that you are taking somebody's private land and interests, how can you do that in the least intrusive way while still achieving the objective that you want to achieve? You should be trying to attempt voluntary acquisition first, and that is done, I think, in most cases, but there are some cases where I think probably I'm right in saying Transport Scotland tends to move mainly towards CPO because they are, for example, working with particularly complex cases and multiple landowners, and it just makes that process easier to have a package where you're looking at it holistically rather than individual land parcels. You need to be looking at how you can provide fair compensation to affected owners and occupiers, and I will talk a bit about more of that later. And the process itself needs to be transparent, with opportunities for people to object to it. So I've set out a slide here. Hopefully you can see that okay. What I would say is that stakeholder engagement is really core to compulsory purchase, and really to any major infrastructure projects or other projects that you're looking to use CPO on. And it must start early, and you will be doing it throughout that whole process, because things will be updating, and you're more likely to get to a better outcome and try and hopefully resolve some concerns or objections if you're having early and ongoing engagement with people that are affected. The design development, which is the box on the left-hand side, Certainly for infrastructure schemes, you will find that design development is ongoing through several of those stages. And actually, in some cases, it will be going on right through that process, even beyond. But obviously, you have to have a bit of a cut-off point where you're saying, right, we've got to the draft, publication of draft orders. This is where the design's got to. We now need to resolve those objections, have a public inquiry, find out whether the scheme's going to be confirmed. And then any design development beyond that is really going to be minor tweaks, I guess, rather than anything substantive. Because obviously by the time you get to draft orders, you really want to be identifying what lands do you require, where and why do you need it, for what purpose is it going to be acquired. So you will be looking at, first of all, looking at what's the need for the project, what's the purpose of it. Alongside that design development, there'll be work ongoing between, preparing the legal documents around the compulsory purchase order and the reasons for doing that. You'll need to be making sure that you're notifying the public at certain stages and advertising it. And you'll probably have various consultation stages before you even get to that. So this is quite a truncated stage here. There are various other intermediate stages before you would even get to that stage of publishing draft orders. If you get objections to it, it is at the moment anyway an automatic public inquiry. We'll see what happens post any bill that comes forward, but I don't imagine that that's going to likely to change substantively, because certainly you want to make sure that people and landowners have the opportunity to have their concerns heard by Scottish ministers before any decision is taken. If there's no objections, then Scottish ministers would move to make their decision. Again, it looks quite simple. This whole process is quite lengthy. It can take several years in some cases it depends on the nature of the scheme. If you're looking at, for example, the purchase of an empty home, a single empty home to use that and bring that back into active use, that's quite a different timescale from looking at, for example, the dualling of the A9. They're very different in terms of the nature of the schemes, and obviously you need to factor that into your timescales. If the orders are approved, then ultimately, obviously, the acquiring authority, whether that's Scottish ministers, local authorities, whoever, will take the possession of the land. But generally speaking, compensation is not paid until after that's done, which was something that I often found quite interesting to sort of realise, and I'll talk about that just in terms of some of the schemes that I've worked on, but it might be years down the line before landowners are actually getting the compensation for the land that's been taken. And there are probably multiple reasons for that, not least the fact that it is a complicated process and timescale to do that. But also one of the reasons is that landowners might not really want to settle what the absolute impacts on their remaining land are until after that project is in place and they can see how it's actually operating and what the impacts are on any land that they have remaining. So you don't necessarily certainly don't get your full and final payment until sometime after the land's been acquired. So some of the projects that I've worked on over the years, and as I say, this was primarily through my work with Jacobs when I was working for a consultancy, AWPR, which is the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route. So when I started in 2007, we were moving towards getting to the public inquiry stage, which is obviously sort of fairly far down the line in terms of the environmental impact assessment had been done, all the work had been done up to there. It was really sort of responding to and dealing with the outstanding objections. So we're now in 2026, and I still have involvement with AWPR in terms of some of the compensation claims and giving some advice to Transport Scotland on what alternative development prospects might have been to help inform the compensation. And that really, I think, just gives you a flavour of how long some of these processes have been. It will remain to be seen whether, obviously, compulsory purchase order reform might help address some of that and help reduce some of those timescales. But ultimately, you can be looking at it for the best part of your career, which I have been up to now. So as I say, in that project, I've been involved in assessing alternative development value. So, for example, where a piece of land is being acquired, and the landowner says, well, I think I could have got planning permission for housing or for commercial use. we're then reviewing that to sort of determine whether we agree with that position, so that the district valuer, who will work on behalf of Transport Scotland, can then go into those negotiations. There are applications called Certificates of Appropriate Alternative Developments, and I don't know whether any of you, particularly in local authorities, have heard of those before, because they do come to you. So if a scheme is going through compulsory purchase, then either the acquiring authority or the affected landowner can apply to the council for a decision as to if that land was not going to be acquired for that particular scheme, is there an alternative land use that you would have granted planning permission for? What would that be? And that then becomes part of that package of information that informs the compensation discussions. I'll talk a wee bit in more detail about that shortly in terms of how that process works, but it's not something that many councils or many planners, I think, have had to deal with throughout their career, and certainly I wasn't really aware of it until I started working on these schemes and had to do it, I was working on them from the scheme promoter side, but certainly it is something that could come to you at some point in your career. And if you don't manage to get to a resolution between the acquiring authority and between the landowner, it can end up at the Lands Tribunal. And again, I've been involved in giving evidence at the Lands Tribunal on behalf of Transport Scotland in terms of the alternative development prospects for the land. A96 dualling and A9 dualling. So yeah, three of these projects are all Transport Scotland projects, trunk roads, and as I say, Transport Scotland is certainly one of the organisations that has used CPO for many of its projects over the years. Been involved in those ones from slightly earlier stage than AWPR, where you were looking at the options for the different infrastructure, the alignments, etc., looking at the environmental impacts assessment, and then sort of taking those through to the public inquiry. And the final one, Egypt TAWS order, is the Edinburgh Glasgow Improvement Programme, which was a scheme to try and upgrade parts of Edinburgh to Glasgow mainline with some fairly significant infrastructure upgrades in terms of things like new parts of railway track, new crossings, so that you were not having trains stopping, etc. Various different things across sort of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Falkirk, Clackmannan, all the different local authorities that are part of the track. It's not happened. So if you're on the train between Glasgow and Edinburgh, you won't see any of these things. And I'll tell you a wee bit more about that shortly. But yes, that was another project that was involved with, where we did the whole environmental impact assessment and trying to coordinate one EIA that covered 5 or 6 different discrete infrastructure elements across different local authority areas, but all as part of the one project, and also with wider infrastructure or other rail enhancements as well, which were sitting outside the scope of the EIA. So that was a very interesting but quite complicated one to deal with. And as I say, it ultimately ended up sitting on the shelf. So I think, although, as I say, a lot of the infrastructure projects that you might come across might not be consented under the Planning Acts, I always think that the planning policies, development plan, all of these things are absolutely critical at the outset in terms of establishing the need and the purpose of why you're looking to do something. How are you going to meet that public interest test? So this slide here is really just, I suppose, kind of setting out kind of the framework, as certainly as I see it at the moment. You've got the statutory outcomes set out in the Planning Act, in terms of meeting housing needs, improving health and well-being, increasing rural population, all these sorts of things which are embedded into National Planning Framework 4. That's sitting alongside the local development plan. So you'll be looking at all of these things alongside, for example, things like the Historic Scotland policy, biodiversity strategy, the climate change strategy. All of those documents are going to be reviewed at an early stage when you're thinking around, how am I going to make the case for the need for this, and how is this sitting in relation to planning objectives, even though it's potentially going to be consented under the Roads Act or a TAWS order or the Electricity Act or anything like that. I think what will be interesting to see in future is how this might influence where CPO or infrastructure might be used for other purposes than the ones that it has mainly been used for up to now, particularly around, well, as I say, meeting housing needs. Glasgow's obviously doing that to an extent. It would be great to see more local authorities doing that as well. But around, improving health or well-being or nature positive places, I think, certainly for me, biodiversity enhancement is a key question in terms of, could you look at CPO for that, or is that taking it a step too far in terms of meeting that private, protecting the private interests and the rights of people that own the land? So in terms of establishing the need for your project, you will be at the outset looking at what the options and alternatives are. And I would say that if you're looking at a big infrastructure scheme, your project objectives are critical to that, because that is what you're going to be measuring that project against at several different stages before you get to this, the sort of the finalised scheme in terms of what you're actually seeking permission for and what you're seeking to acquire. So you'd be looking at, as I say, things like the need in the policy context. You'd be looking at, gathering as much evidence as you can, engaging with the right stakeholders. In many cases, there may not be bespoke or established guidance on how to do this. Some types of schemes do. Transport Scotland uses the design manual for roads and bridges, which sets out quite a sort of structured way of doing it, but other ones like Network Rail don't have the same sort of thing. And if you're doing, potentially a place regeneration project, how would you be setting that out in terms of the actual assessment approach and methodology that you're going to use? The other thing I would say about setting project objectives is you need to be really careful in thinking about how much detail you put in that at the outset. So say, for example, in the case of something like A96 dualling, where we were looking at several different, we knew we were going to be looking at various different corridor options, route alignments, all these sorts of things. If you've got project objectives that just say protect the environment, well, how are you making any distinction at the outset between broad corridor options to sort of measure what are the best options to take forward? But if you go to the nth amount of detail, you don't have that amount of detail at that stage because you're maybe still looking at quite a broad area as opposed to specific parcels of land or specific route alignments. So it's really important to think at the outset about as to how you set out your objectives that are going to get you from the start of the project and the level of detail you might have there to the end of the project, and identify land parcels, specific design, mitigation, all these sorts of things. In terms of thinking about your alternatives, you have to think about what would be reasonable alternatives, and certainly for many of these larger schemes, you'll be doing an environmental impact assessment as part of that. So obviously, as part of the EIA process, you need to be looking at your alternatives for that too. But that very much crosses over into the CPO world as well, because in both cases, you're having to explain why is this the right solution, why is this the best solution to take forward, as opposed to something else that could be done. And those will certainly in some cases be spatial alternatives. So as I say, for example, again, looking at a road scheme, you might be looking at several different corridor options of where a new road might go, but you might, in some cases, you're not necessarily going to have any other spatial options. So for example, a railway, the railways where it is, if you're looking at improving that, you've got pretty limited opportunities in terms of where you might be redirecting that. But you might be thinking about non-spatial alternatives. So, for example, re-timetabling or ticketing or other things that are going to try and get you to that objective of, say, for example, getting people from A to B faster, or encouraging more people to use sustainable transport and all these sorts of things. You need to make sure that your options appraisals are proportionate in terms of the stage that you're at, the level of detail that you've got, and the amount of engagement that you're going to do, bearing in mind that people will be very interested in, particularly some of these big schemes. And from the outset, you've got in the back of your mind that challenge at public inquiry is most likely, because ultimately, if you're using compulsory purchase, people probably are going to be objecting to that. So you need to make sure that every stage of it is really carefully thought through and that you're able to defend the decisions that you make by the time you get to that stage. But sometimes political influence and economic change can really impact on what happens. So, for example, the one I mentioned in Egypt, I think I worked on that one for about the best part of 2 years, where we got to a stage where we had the full draft environmental impact assessment ready. And at that stage, Scottish ministers took a decision that they were going to scrap that whole part of the infrastructure part and focus on other aspects of improvement to the rail network. That package of EIA then sat on a shelf for probably about 5 or 6 years before parts of it were pulled out for another project to try and enhance various parts of the same railway network. Again, that's not gone forward. So again, you can be doing a lot of this work and then ultimately, and I'm sure those of you who work for local authorities will be very familiar with how the political landscape can influence decisions. Some of these things just might not go ahead. And similarly for A96, initially Scottish Government's position was that all trunk roads were expected to be dualled by, I think it was initially 2025. Then when we had the SNP and Green Coalition and the Butte House Agreement, SNP government at that stage committed to reviewing the A96 and the dualling of the A96. So although the original intention was for it to be dualled from Aberdeen to Inverness the whole way, but now potentially looking at just stages of that and looking at other improvements that can be done that might achieve the same objectives around improving transport hubs and railway improvements and all these other sorts of things. So in terms of your project preparation, these are just some of the things that I've found over the years. Certainly I'm working on some of these big multidisciplinary projects with various different, lots of different specialists. You absolutely need a clear communication process with it. You might have, you've got design teams, you'll have EIA team, which might include sort of 50 odd different specialists, depending on what you're looking at doing. You've got, certainly for some of the bigger projects, you might have a dedicated stakeholder engagement team. And when you're looking at compulsory purchase, you will have land referencing and legal teams to make sure that they've fully identified what all aspects of the title and ownership of the land is. And all of those teams need to be communicating with each other and understanding how their part of the puzzle is fitting into it. It's also really important to make sure that you include the right people early on, that you're not, getting too far down the line and thinking, oh wait, actually maybe there's an air quality issue here and we've not thought about that. We need to get them involved now. So just making sure that you're thinking about that early on as part of your, if you're doing environmental impact assessment scoping or any of these sorts of things. Timing and timetabling is critical. So whilst you might have your sort of principal means of authorisation, whether that's planning permission or whether that's a roads order, and also you're looking at the compulsory purchase. If you're looking at that, there will be other sorts of types of consents that could be needed in terms of habitat regulations, protected species licensing, listed building, all these other sorts of things. So again, sort of early, making sure that the project team is familiar with and has mapped out what the different sorts of consents might be needed, when are those going to be needed by, how do you take those steps backwards in terms of what work you need to do to get there is really important. But it is also important to think about how you embed some flexibility in that, because obviously things, particularly if you're working on a project over the best part of 2-3 years to try and get to that point for submission, things will happen and change. So you need to be able to think about how you're leaving yourself enough flexibility. And as I say, you're obviously thinking about just how you're coordinating between different work programs that are all trying to get to the same endpoint, but doing very different tasks as you get there. And again, all of these things will be points of challenge at public inquiry if they're not thought about and managed throughout. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, speaking to communities, and when I talk about stakeholders, obviously, it's not necessarily just the people whose land might be getting acquired. You've also got so the statutory and other non-statutory consultees, environmental groups, other local communities that are going to be impacted by the scheme, even though they might not be having any lands acquired for them. So, as I say, certainly for some of the bigger projects, it's quite regular now to have a dedicated stakeholder team who will manage that process and lead on that process, making sure that they are targeting the type of communication that you make is the right message at the right time and the right means of doing it. You would certainly be thinking about, if you're going through an options appraisal, you're not doing stakeholder engagement, which is going to effectively say, well, this is a fait accompli and this is what we're doing. How are you making sure that you're allowing for genuine comments and engagement and thinking about what the options and alternatives might be. You'll be thinking about how you might include everybody and get the message out to the right people. Whether that's a combination of virtual or in person. How are you looking at sort of accessibility of your documents and involving those less heard groups? Making sure that your whole team knows the key messages, and particularly if you've got specialists that are going out and doing survey work, and somebody comes up to you and says, oh, what are you doing here? You've got high vis on, and I see you've got some equipment there. What's happening? If you've not got the right, if you're not familiar with what the right message is and what you can say and what you can't say, that can obviously get into some hot water. Land surveys, again for like AWPR, Egypt, A96, all of those have required multiple land surveys. So you'll be looking at ecology surveys, you'll be looking at landscape surveys, you'll be looking at noise, air quality, traffic surveys, all of these different sorts of things. And very often some of those surveys are all going to be concentrated on the same piece of land or the same landowner. So if you've got people that are coming out to say, well, week one, I'm doing some ecology surveys, and then you've got the landscape people out, and then you've got the traffic people out, that's going to be pretty annoying for landowners if they just feel like they're constantly bombarded with people coming out to visit. So again, it's really important to try and make sure that you coordinate that as best you can. You can't do everything all at the same time, and certain types of surveys will have different criteria in terms of how they have to be managed, whether there might be nighttime and dusk surveys, all these sorts of things. But trying to make sure that there's coordination throughout that process to try and minimise the intrusion on people and landowners, and also thinking very carefully if you're working in rural areas about the impacts on, for example, farming and farmers got livestock and all these sorts of things that you need to think about. You need to keep checking that your land identification and the sort of identifying who the owners are is aligning with the design and mitigation. So, for example, if the ecologists come out and say, well, actually, this would be great if we could put this whole big area of compensatory planting over here, but you're not aligning that or communicating that with the land referencing team, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, that's not land that we've been looking at. We don't know who owns that. We don't know who can acquire it. You need to make sure that you're sort of discussing that throughout so that everybody's aware of what pieces of land are being talked about. And certainly one of the things that we've found helpful with some of the major infrastructure schemes has been setting up consultee working groups. So where you've got SEPA and Sort of Scotland and Nature Scot, etc., and they'd be all part of the same working group so that you can talk about some of the issues collectively rather than trying to go to different ones individually. So one of the other areas that I've been involved with compulsory purchase orders, I say, has been assessing. I don't assess the compensation. I'm not a surveyor, I'm not a valuer, but I do inform that process by advising clients on what alternative development prospects might have been. And it's actually a really interesting thing to do, but a very tricky thing to do, because where you're looking at, so say for example, you've got a landowner that's saying, I could have put housing on that piece of land if you weren't buying it from this road. You have to make that judgment in what we call the no scheme world. So you have to assume that the scheme, the purpose for which you're acquiring that land, does not exist. And in some cases, you're having to assume that it never has existed. So I think for me, that's always been a really tricky thing to do, particularly where you're looking at major infrastructure projects, which have been very much embedded in local development plans and policies and strategies potentially for a number of years, to then say, well, wait a minute, take that out of the picture. What would you have got planning permission for, or what land use might have been acceptable? So it's a really difficult thing to do. It's completely theoretical, obviously, because the land is being acquired. You know, the project as it stands is currently intended to go ahead, and you're also looking at it retrospectively because you're looking at it at a specific point in time. So, for example, for AWPR, although we are still looking at some outstanding claims for that, the date that we are assessing, that it is assessing on, is 2013, which was when the vesting, the land was vested. So you're having to look at what the planning situation might have been at that point in time, taking out the scheme, so imagining that wasn't there, and then thinking, well, what might have been an alternative land use, or what might have been granted planning permission. So there's a lot of digging around of trying to find historical documents, which are not always on, obviously not on council's websites anymore because they've been superseded. Trying to dig out planning history and just sort of really trying to sort of put that picture together. There's a number of things that and we'll say there's no set methodology for doing it. You know, you do have legislation in case law, but very much it's about that kind of professional judgment in terms of how you would assess it. And I've always taken it in terms of looking at what the development plan was at that point in time, trying to analyse what parts of that development plan relate to the scheme, trying to sort of discount those, and then thinking about how other outcomes might have influenced that. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, and obviously it's very easy to get to quite opposing positions, which is often what happens when these things get to lands tribunal as well. You'd be looking at not just the land that's been taken, but you're also thinking about the land that's retained by that landowner. So, you know, they might only have a small portion of it taken, but they're saying, well, that's a key access point of where I would have got access into the land that has now been allocated for housing. So I think, you know, that needs to be taken into account in terms of the valuation as well. You're also, the law, the legislation requires that you're assuming that no alternative would be provided. So again, when you're looking at something like AWPR, which is the bypass around Aberdeen, and there were numerous different corridors initially considered, you're looking at in the context that nothing else is provided. So it's not just that they were going to put it over there instead of here, nothing is going to be provided. And as I mentioned before, you know, you have got the option of things like applying for a certificate of appropriate alternative development, but that might have been done quite earlier in the process. So by the time you get to the Lands Tribunal, which has been years later, it's then questionable to how relevant that still is, because actually the dates that you assessed the CAD on were dates different from the dates that you're assessing the final one on. So it's quite a niche area. I'm not expecting that most of you will necessarily deal with this throughout your career, but it's just useful to be aware of in terms of some of the principles. And obviously, if as local authorities you want to make use of CPO, these are things that you need to be aware of, that you would be having to take into account as part of that in terms of acquiring the land. So that is pretty much me in terms of the points that I wanted to talk to you about. I have got a few points here that I thought it might be useful to have a discussion, and obviously happy to take any questions at all on anything else that you think of. But some of the points that I think are useful, it would be useful to have a discussion around, or to get your views on whether you think CPO can and should it be used more widely. Are there any of the outcomes that are sitting in terms of National Planning Framework 4 or other local or other national policy objectives that you think should we be using it to try and help deliver? One of the things that has been on my mind is how that sort of necessary test could include land for biodiversity enhancement, because that is clearly a policy outcome of the Scottish Government, but in effect you're trying to minimise the amount of land that you would take from somebody, whilst you may well be looking at compensatory planting. to mitigate the loss of, for example, any woodland, etc. Certainly up to now, there's not really been any examples that I'm aware of where that you could make a case for saying, actually, we'll take some additional land so that we can try and enhance things further in terms of Scottish Government policy. So I'm interested in how that might play out. And also, yeah, an interesting point around should the benefits of the project influence the compensation that might be paid to a landowner. So if you have, you know, a major piece of infrastructure that is effectively enabling the development, how should that be taken into account in terms of the compensation paid? Now, certainly from my perspective and having looked at it from the promoter's side, we have often come to the view that that certainly should be taken into account, but through the the practitioners and advisory group process and sort of hearing more from those that represent the landowners more regularly, you know, I think an excellent point was made that if you've got one landowner who's having a piece of land that's being taken from them, and they could have, say, for example, think that that particular scheme is going to allow for a new urban development, should that not be taken into account versus a neighbouring landowner that's not having any land taken from them, but also they're getting that enhancement in land value as well. So it's an interesting point, and I think there's no straight answer to it, but certainly something worth thinking about and discussing. Thank you. Okay, any questions or?
Thank you, Gillian. We will also leave time for the online audiences to ask any questions. So we will give questions for our in-person audiences, and then we will see if our online audiences have any questions. Feel free to type in the chat bar or just unmute yourself. Yeah, so question from the floor first.
I guess I was kind of going a little bit more insight in curious to know about the what kind of conflict with the landowners or what kind of powers they hold in terms of, you know, do they often fight back against these things and how that kind of works out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamics of working on a project where you're using CPO is quite different from a project where the developer is also the landowner, because yes, absolutely, and you can absolutely understand that people are very worried and concerned about what's going to happen to their land, about not just the land, but also sort of if they live next door to you know, an area which is being proposed for a new road or railway enhancement, etc., what the impacts are. So yes, it can be, tensions can rightly be high when you're doing consultation on these sorts of aspects. You know, I mean, sure, the same does happen, I suppose, with any project where you've got neighbours that are concerned about what's going to be happening near to them and what the impacts on that are going to be. But